continue with the topic of competitive dynamics. This week our Group 3 would like to introduce to you two papers. Paper 1, Non-Response and Delayed Response to Competitive Moves, the Roles of Competitor Dependence, and Action Irreversibility. The fundamental questions in competition. What do some actions fail to elicit responses from competitors, but others provoke rapid responses? And the second question is, when responses do occur, can delay be predicted, and the challenge match the action or be an escalation? A principal purpose was to identify variables strategy that used to compensate for incompleteness of information when studying the basic building block of competitive interaction. The action-response dyads. Using a game theoretical framework, authors identified two important variables that may play such a role in variance reduction. Firstly, a competitor's dependence on the markets affected by an action, and, second, is the irreversibility of a competitive action. Furthermore, drawn from an extensive review of competition in the airline industry, this study used irreversibility of action and competitor dependence to predict the following dimensions of response. Firstly, the likelihood of non-response from a given competitor. Secondly, response delay. And thirdly, the likelihood the response will match an initial move. In the framework of this game situation, four problems arise that need to be addressed in studying and understanding competitive exchange in actual strategic situations. First of all, estimating payoffs. Next, response delay. Then, matching response. Finally, price moves. Now, estimating payoffs, authors developed the basic argument that in the absence of complete information about players' payoffs, competitor dependence and irreversibility of the competitive move are useful variables that can be used to indicate the payoffs and probabilities of. Firstly, competitor dependence. Competitors are generally motivated to respond and to make quicker and stronger responses if they view an action as a threat to important markets. Thus, this paper hypothesized that, Hypothesis 1a, the greater a defender's dependence on the markets under attack, the lower the likelihood of non-response. Irreversibility of a move can signal commitment, and therefore, the likelihood that a defender will elect not to respond to a competitive move by an attacker reshaped in part by the move's irreversibility. Therefore, Hypothesis 1b will be, the more irreversible an action, the greater the likelihood of non-response. In addition to main effects, competitor dependence and irreversibility may generate an interaction effect. Although the irreversibility of a competitive move generally increases the likelihood of non-response. Therefore, the likelihood of non-response will be low when dependence and irreversibility are both high. Hypothesis 1c. Although the likelihood of non-response will generally increase with an action's irreversibility when high irreversibility and high dependence occur together, this positive relationship will be reversed, and the likelihood of non-response will decrease. Next part, we will illustrate response delay. Response delay is important in that it represents a period during which an initiator reaps the economic benefits of an action, provided the action is effective. First, it is likely that competitors will hasten to defend markets they depend on. Hypothesis 2a. The greater a defender's dependence on the markets affected by an attacker's action, the quicker its response will be. Second, Hypothesis 2b. The more irreversible an action, the longer a defender will take to respond. Competitor dependence and irreversibility may also create an interaction effect for response delay, with competitor dependence and response delay moderated by irreversibility. Hypothesis 2c. Although response delay will generally increase with increasing irreversibility, when high irreversibility and high dependence occur together, this relationship will be reversed, and response delay will decrease. A defender with high dependence on affected markets will tend to match an initial move to signal commitment to defend its markets. But that the greater its dependence, the more it will be inclined to match the move so as to avoid escalation. Hypothesis 3a. The greater a responding defender's dependence on the markets affected by an attacker's action, the higher the likelihood that it will directly match the action. The irreversibility of a move should also play an interesting role here. Hypothesis 3b. The likelihood of a matching response will increase as dependence increases. And when high irreversibility and high dependence occur together, this positive relation will be augmented. Price moves. Since price changes directly affect a business's bottom line, it is much easier to estimate their impact on the profits of both an attacker and a defender than it is to estimate the impact of other types of competitive moves. Thus, Hypothesis 4 was developed when an action is a price move. A. The likelihood of non-response will be lower. B. Response delay will be shorter. And C. The likelihood of a matching response will be greater than will be the case with other types of moves. In the framework of this game situation, 4 problems arise above that need to be addressed in studying and understanding competitive exchange in actual strategic situation. Method. The data for this study concerned the competitive moves. Exchange. The 32 U.S. airlines were reported in Aviation Daily between the years 1979 and 1986. The total data set consisted of 856 actions, 103 of which provoked at least one response, and 203 responses. Authors performed logistic regression analysis using ordinary least squares multiple regression analysis to test the hypotheses. Measurement. Firstly, competitor dependence was defined as the extent to which a competitor relies on the markets affected by an action. Secondly, the irreversibility of competitive moves was assessed using a questionnaire mailed to 430 senior airline executives and experts. Thirdly, likelihood of non-response was defined as the estimated probability that an action would not provoke retaliation from a given competitor. Then, response delay was measured as the length of time a responding competitor took to react to an action. Finally, likelihood of a matching response was defined as the estimated probability that a responder would imitate an action. Final part. The results suggest that competitor dependence depresses chances of non-response and increases response delay and the likelihood that a responder will match a move. And then, action irreversibility generally has the opposite effect. In addition, the interaction of competitor dependence and action irreversibility is significant. Analyses of the performance implications of competitive exchange indicated that attackers and early responders gain market share at the expense of late responders and non-responders.
Now, move to the second paper, Organizational Information Processing, Competitive Responses, and Performance in the U.S. Domestic Airline Industry. The central question in this study is how firms build competitive advantage by focusing on the specific actions and responses of competitor.
The purposes of the study is test hypotheses which predict in competitors' responses and to link variations in response to performance. In this paper, the authors identified 4 important attributes of response: response imitation, response likelihood, response lag, and response order. Then explaining them in terms of the signal or information represented in the type of action to which a firm is responding, as well as the information processing characteristics and capabilities of the responding firm. They then related importance of response to competitive advantage and tested it by focusing on its link to performance.
An action was defined as a specific and detectable competitive move, like price cut, new product introduction, initiated by a firm to defend or improve competitive position. Similarly, a response is a clear-cut and discernible counteraction taken by a competing firm with regard to one or more competitors to defend or improve its position. The key argument is that when a firm's action generates above normal economic profits, the rivals will respond because they want to participate in the profits. Moreover, it is expected that, as the profits derived from an action increase, so will the speed and number of responders who will attempt to mimic or duplicate it. Therefore, firms want to take action against competitors who are unlikely to respond. It means have a low response likelihood, or who respond slowly. It's demonstrating a high response lag. A third dimension, response order, the position in a temporal series of responses a firm occupies. Finally, response imitation, or the degree to which a response mimics an action.
Given the theorized importance of response, it is relevant to ask what factors influence response as measured by these four characteristics. The authors predicted response on the manner in which a responding firm processes information, both in the detection of competitors' action and implementation of response. Information processing incorporates the analysis and transfer of data from the boundary points of an organization to manager as they attempt to make meaningful decisions. The information processing dimensions in this study were the information represented by, first of all, type of a competitor's action, strategic or tactical. Strategic actions involve commitments of specific, distinctive resources and are difficult to implement in reverse. For example, a major change in the definition of business. Tactical actions, often designed to fine-tune strategy, they involve fewer and more general resources than strategic actions, are easier to implement and more reversible. There will be more responders to tactical actions than strategic actions, and a given firm will have less opportunity to be the first among group of responders to respond. The overall hypothesis is strategic actions will negatively affect, imitate, likelihood of response, average response order, and positively with average response lag.
Secondly, the sensory systems of responding firms. A response cannot occur if a decision maker does not realize that a competitor has made a move. Hence, sensory or sensing systems are a vital concern to the quality and speed of decision making. Firms with an external orientation will be more open and more likely to sense a rival's actions than those with an internal orientation. In addition, firms with an external orientation will be more capable of implementing competitive responses than those with an internal orientation. Thus, hypothesis 2, an external orientation is positively related to likelihood of response and negatively related to imitate average response lag and average response order.
The next dimension, information processing and analyzing mechanisms, the structure of organization, tends to be major influence on information capacity and analyzing mechanisms. One critical aspect of structure is structural complexity, which refers to number of organizational levels and departments in organization as relative to total size. Authors argued that decision makers in structurally complex firms will receive competitor information late and less rich information with which to develop alternatives. Thus, they will have difficulty responding, respond slowly, and later, and more likely to follow and imitate the actions of rivals than those in structurally simpler firms. The above suggests that Hypothesis 3, structural complexity, is negatively related to the likelihood of a response and positively related to lag and average response order.
The final dimension, decision-making processes, the costs of search, and the human characteristics of decision makers can influence information search. Slack was defined as the cushion of potential resource, which allows the organization to adapt to internal or external pressures or to initiate changes in strategy. This paper pointed out that firms with ample Slack resources responded faster and more effectively to environmental crisis and more able to implement responses. Wilias firm with little Slack will be more likely, on the average, to imitate rivals' actions than firms with great Slack. Authors hypothesize that the degree of Slack is positively affect the likelihood of response and negatively related to propensity to imitate average response lag and order. Human factors can bias an information search process. In particular, the education and experience levels of a firm's top management team can critically influence information search activities and thus decision making. High educated managers are likely to respond and quickly to respond and respond earlier. Moreover, they will be less likely to imitate rival actions. On the other hand, experienced managers will be engaged in limited search when faced with competitive action. They will tend to avoid risky action that affect their flexibility. In contrast, less experienced managers will be likely to engage in novel and risky actions, have more stamina, and be more able to learn new behaviors. Therefore, less experienced managers are more likely to respond faster, and will respond earlier, and also be more likely not to mimic the actions of rivals. Hypothesis 4b, less experience and high education among the top managers positive affect the response likelihood and negative to imitate average response lag and order.
The relationship between competitive response and performance was represented in the final hypothesis. A firm's response profile, as measured by imitation, likelihood, lag, and order, can signify the extent of its combativeness in the marketplace. For example, non-imitative, likely, fast, and first responders can be considered aggressive competitors, whereas opposite responders can be viewed as non-aggressive. An aggressive response may prove crucial to the outcome of a competitive battle. An aggressive response can also lead to advantage for a responding firm by blocking the success of a competitor's action. In addition, an aggressive response can effectively shape the information and assumptions of actors. An aggressive response serves to signal rivals of the responding firm's aggressive intentions which may lead to a more cooperative relationship at a later date. Therefore, although all responses are important, non-imitative responses should be associated with higher levels of performance than imitative responses. Hypothesis 5, likelihood of response, is positively related to performance. Propensity to imitate, average response lag, and order are negatively related to performance.
Let's look at the next session of this paper, methodology. The primary source of data on actions and responses was Aviation Daily. The dataset comprised of 418 competitive responses to 191 competitive actions over an 8 years period in U.S. domestic airline industry.
We then discuss the measures of variables in more detail as following. First of all, the response variables, average year-end, organizational response, were calculated for each of the 4 response attributes for each responding firm. Response likelihood was calculated by summing the number of times each airline responded to competitors' actions during a given year. Response imitation was measured in terms of the concurrence of the type of action and the type of response. Response lag was measured by the amount of time it took a firm to respond to a competitor's action. Response order was measured as the rank, position, and time of the responding firm among all responders, measured as averaging order of responders for each action for each year.
Next, the measure of type of action. These different types of action were classified as strategic or tactical by 6 professors with expertise in the airline industry. The total 158 tactical and 33 strategic actions then measured the proportions of the relative responses to strategic and tactical actions for each organization for each year.
The measures of organizational information processing variables. The external orientation was inferred from how many of its vice presidents were in marketing and customer relations with information drawn from the World Aviation Directory. Structural complexity was defined as the number of separate parts in an organization, reflected by the number of levels and departments with size control. Absorbed slack was the amount of selling, general, and administrative expenses divided by total revenue, measure reflecting slack that is absorbed by costs. Unabsorbed slack measured by the extent to which current liabilities covered the sum of and marketable securities for a year. Managers' education and experience levels gathered data of the CEO and 7 other randomly chosen corporate executives for each airline for each year. Finally, performance was measured in terms of net profit after taxes divided by total revenue. Data for this profitability measure came from air carrier financial statistics.
Let's move to the final section of this research results. Some support for the hypothesis 1. Airlines responded more slowly and less response to strategic action than to tactical actions. Hypothesis 2 supported. As predicted, external orientation is positive to response likelihood and negatively related to lag and order. There is no support for response imitation. Hypothesis 3 was partial supported. As structural complexity increases, response likelihood decreases. Structural complexity is positive to response order. No support for others. Hypothesis 4A, as predicted, unabsorbed slack is negatively related to response imitation. However, unabsorbed slack is negatively related to response likelihood. There is also a negative, but only marginally significant, relationship between absorbed slack and response lag. No support emerged for response order. Finally, there is partial support for hypothesis 4B. Contrary to expectations, organizations managed by highly educated teams were more likely to imitate the actions of competitors. No support for remaining response variables. As expected, less experienced managers were likely to respond and to respond early than more experienced teams. Years of experience is unrelated to response imitation and lag.
The findings supported the notion that a firm's response can be predicted from the manner in which it interprets and processes information. Further, 3 of the 4 response characteristics were related to performance, that are response likelihood, response lag, and response order.
That's all our group presentation. Thank you for watching.